Because I'm not the expert on CBAM, but it will have quite an impact on carbon markets, I'm extremely excited to have an expert on the show today, which is Dan from Redshaw Advisors. I'm so happy you could come on short notice. We were texting on Saturday, and then we just made it real quick, get Dan on the show. Can you maybe introduce you just quickly? How did you get into CBAM? What are you doing at Redshaw Advisors? And then we can jump right into.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on, and it's wonderful to have another show. As we all appreciate, the carbon markets can be rather complex, and having some folks to break it down, and as I like to call to take carbonese and speak English with it, is something I think the market definitely needs. So my name's Dan Maleski. I have the pleasure of leading the hedging and risk team here at Redshaw Advisors, focusing and helping companies interact with the costs that these global compliance carbon markets create. I find this quite an interesting space, the intersection between climate, trade, and finance coming together in an intersection. And well, right now that intersection is the CBAM. So more than happy to get into this and hopefully do my best to talk English today, not Carbonese.
No, that's fantastic. I'm German. My wife's South African, and talking English in general is already a challenge sometimes. But then talking English in carbon markets is definitely the next difficulty. So super excited. Can you maybe give us just a small, I would say, status quo? Are we with CBAM? And then also the next step is, why has everyone been posting the whole week about CBAM? What happened?
Yeah, and so the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is really just an extension of the EU ETS, emissions trading system. And due to the size of the EU ETS, any inherent demand that's created from this market, or indirectly via the CBAM, is of course going to get on people's radar. The EU ETS has almost a yearly traded volume of north of 6, 7, 800 billion US dollars. So it's in many sizes larger than global copper market, and it's a massive market. And so tapping into this demand is going to be quite of interest to, I'm sure, most of your audience, and in general, a lot of the efforts for climate change throughout the world. Now, recently, we've had some clarification on, specifically within the CBAM, what costs of carbon paid the European Commission might view as deductible under the regime. Now, I could sit here for about 3 hours explaining what that actually means, but principally, Europe is aware that it's not the only country on the block with the cost of carbon. And furthermore, within the CBAM, it's actually hoping to incentivize a lot of its trading partners to get these costs of carbon. And last week, exactly a week from today, exactly last Wednesday, we've finally got our hands on a long-awaited implementation act, which clarifies a lot of the groundwork on what costs specifically the European Commission would see as applicable, and of interest to, I'm sure, many on this event. Carbon credits came up a number of times. Now, that's not the first time we've seen carbon credits in CBAM legislation. Back in December 17th of 2025, Article 6 credits made their way into some of the proposed changes the Commission created. But this is a significant step in the right direction of potentially allowing mandatory ETS regimes, which allow carbon credits within that that market to be seen as a cost of carbon paid. And so that's going to be quite big news for a lot of countries that have an emissions trading system or carbon tax that allow a portion of the shortfall to be met with offsets. I mean, virtually most of the ETSs in the world allow some kind of offset, typically approved domestic offsets, but offsets nevertheless to be incorporated into that regime. So this is some great news for them, and potentially some good news for the wider VCM market, as a new source of potential demand has been opened up.
Yeah, you just mentioned, and I talked about it all the way in the beginning, the current spot market and the VCM is like between 1 and billion, and you just mentioned the EU ETS is somewhere 700 billion. Obviously, everyone's eyes and ears are opening up real quick. Could you talk us a little bit through, like, what could this mean volume-wise for markets? Is there like any kind of direction that we could look at?
Well, so if we're looking at this quantitatively, it'd be difficult for me to throw out any objective numbers, as these markets obviously are going to be very nuanced.
Yeah.
To give you an example, the EU ETS, we see a typical secondary market daily traded volume of between 15 to maybe 25 million tons. Now, the EU ETS, as it is a very liquid market and it is open to speculators, a lot of that
Yeah.
volume isn't just buying for compliance demand. It's the hedge funds and the bank buying and selling, readjusting their positions, which of course the exchanges like because it increases the traded volume. But it doesn't actually mean there's 20 million tons of EUAs every day being bought to use to compliance. And therefore, taking that reference of call it 700 million euros or dollars of traded volume isn't necessarily a good reference for CBAM, because unlike the EU ETS, which does allow and encourage in some regard speculators within that regime, there's no speculators for CBAM. The only people who will be exposed to CBAM are the importers. And the importers predominantly are going to be buying from your industrial sectors. And industry doesn't pollute anywhere near as much as power for most of these developing countries. And so if I look at the potential demand that CBAM could generate is, first of all, it's indirect demand, but second of all, it's going to be geared toward the industrials, not the power installations. And the power installations, even the EU ETS, but especially before we decarbonized significant back in 2005, call it, the vast majority of demand came from utilities. Furthermore, if I haven't lost anyone yet, I know we're going quite quick here. Furthermore, the changes to CBAM don't apply to CBAM authorized declarants. So don't actually apply to the European importers. It simply applies to the exporting domestic countries. Let's say I'm South Korea. I'm South Korea. I have all these steel mills within my jurisdiction that are exposed to the South Korean ETS. And so as a result of some of those steel mills potentially wanting to export to Europe, they are going to obviously want to ensure that the cost of carbon that they're paying in South Korea would be deemed as acceptable under CBAM. All CBAM is saying is, for South Korea's example specifically, because they allow some offsets, yes, it will. Now, the domino effect of that is that could incentivize further countries that don't have a robust cost of carbon yet to potentially be much more comfortable toying with the idea of incorporating carbon credits within the regime. So if we're looking at a direct demand, it's hard to pick a number because, again, it's not the actual I mean, I could give you the numbers of the CBAM authorized declarants, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about demand-wise. Rather, it's the wider geopolitical element that CBAM is incentivizing and encouraging. That potentially could lead to demand. A lot of caveats within that, the incentivization of a treasury of a ministry, for example, wanting the revenue to go to a developer or auction allowances. And again, I could be here for an hour, but from a bird's eye perspective, that's where the low-hanging fruit could be if I was a project developer looking at the developments and what kind of demand it could potentially generate. Is that?
Now, it sounds fair. So it basically means, okay, we can't say how much, but obviously I think last week I talked to 10 German companies, and I think 8 of them, they're all directly impacted by CBAM. And obviously now there'll be a lot of different strategies going on. It gives them more flexibility, figuring out like how can, in the end, obviously for them it's about price. How can I pay the lowest price to still import this as part? But it will give them a lot of flexibility, if I'm right.
So the flexibility won't, and I completely appreciate that logic, and potentially, indirectly, it'll create flexibility, but it won't be the flexibility of the German importer. It'll be, let's say I'm a German importer buying my steel from Turkey or Egypt. The flexibility that this creates is actually for the Egyptian government or the Turkish government that now can be much more confident that if they create an ETS and that ETS has carbon credits within that mandatory regime, then CBAM would recognize it. Very simply speaking, CBAM is very
Mm.
strict on what they actually say is a cost of carbon. And the main principle is a cost of carbon has to be under a mandatory regime. So a legally binding carbon market, carbon tax that forces, let's say, a company in Turkey to pay for the greenhouse gases that they emit. That is the only cost of carbon that the European Commission deems as
Wow.
correct. So that the Turkish company can't just buy any VCM or even a
Yeah.
CDR project and claim that as a cost of carbon. Europe's saying, sadly, no. Only under a mandatory regime. And this announcement is clarifying to those countries who can create these mandatory regimes what specific costs gives a thumbs up, and that thumbs up in this realm is certain criteria around carbon credits.
Okay, but if I understand this correctly, then this is one of the, to my knowledge, biggest incentives we've seen so far to harmonize global carbon markets, because
Yes,
other countries now have a first time ever have a real incentive that comes from their own economy to set these
yes.
markets. Oh wow, okay,
The the
it all makes sense.
the issue here is people do not appreciate how expensive carbon is in Europe. When we
Mm.
look at how much our clients are paying every year, it's going to boggle the mind if you're a South Korean or a Turkish cement company. I mean, a lot of them, truly, a lot of them are astonished with how expensive carbon is in Europe. Not just how expensive it is on the secondary exchange, but the net cost of it, so net of free allocation. And it's wonderful to talk about a harmonized cost of carbon, but if you look at the economics of that, you can't just snap your finger and have a cost of carbon. You're gonna bankrupt industry. They need a long runway. I mean, the EU ETS is at a
Yeah,
runway for better half of 15, like 20 years,
yeah.
and we're barely getting the position where industry is truly exposed. They've had time to ramp up investments and abate emissions, and so a harmonized cost of carbon is a wonderful idea, and I think that's where the runway is, the direction of the runway. But we have to also compare that and align that with the practicalities of industry, which is it moves slow and they need time to adjust.
That's fantastic. Now, the next question I have is just when I look at the different markets, like how do you actually get them harmonized? Because my thinking is the easiest example, and I thought I can remember that there were a lot of conversation was already when the EU ETS was talking with the UK ETS about linking up. And then talking about what maybe potential CDR credits I could bring into the EU ETS
Yep.
and what kind of potential credits would be in the UK ETS. They are nature-based, but Europe only tech-based. How do you actually harmonize these? Is it possible or?
Well, there's a precedent, the EU in Switzerland. Australia tried doing it a while. The issue is we're not talking about policies. We're talking about markets. And when you get into the realm of markets, you appreciate how they act isn't something you can always control. Um, there's all of these small questions we have to appreciate. What's the legal jurisdiction going to be? So let's say Turkey and the EU merge. What happens if a Turkish company does something incorrect? What court of law will they be tried under? Right? We get really minute into those elements, and it doesn't become a conversation not necessarily about policy. A wider conversation about markets occur. So, for example, when we had the ongoing UK and EU ETS linking conversation, I believe within the wider package they were talking about fishing rights, right? So it's much wider than just linking carbon
Yeah.
markets. If it was that easy, we could do it. But all of these carbon markets are different. The EU and the UK ETS, they have a different linear reduction factor. The UK has a different, has a floor price. They have all of these different small tweaks and small designs, and that's only the EU and the UK ETS. If we take a step back, we look at most of the carbon markets around the world. Most of them have a relative cap. The EU has an absolute cap. Most of them, they are very different if you actually open up the hood and look at them. If you look at the price on the exchange, you can just say, oh, why don't we combine them, create more liquidity? It doesn't work like that. It's much, much more nuanced. And that's why, I'll end it with this because I don't want to go over. That's why when we look at potential linking conversations between the EU and the UK, appreciate Brexit only happened a few years ago. Most of the analysts are expecting that to potentially occur by 2028, maybe 2029. And so what should, on surface be a quite simple, puzzle piece coming together, if you take a step back, you appreciate these are markets. These are very large financial markets. It's very difficult to actually incorporate them. So CBAM does create some urgency incentive for that, but again, from a practical perspective, it's quite hard to do.
So what does that mean for, let's say, corporate in Germany? Obviously, we're doing a lot of business in Germany, but also overall Europe. But let's just talk about the company in Germany. So these kind of new insights, because it's not it's not actual law by now. These kind of new insights, they will have actually not that much impact on a corporate can't do a lot. It's more about probably prices that they will have to pay at the end that will change, or how does a corporate in Germany need to think about these things?
A corporate in Germany needs to take a big old step back, and they have to look at what markets are they buying from. They have to look, if I'm buying steel, for example, buying 1 ton of steel could trade between, let's say, 600 euros to 700 euros. Right now, as a result of CBAM, if I buy my steel in Germany, depending on the type of steel, call it 600 euros. If I buy it from China, it's going to be maybe 700 euros because of CBAM. CBAM, as of a few months ago, added a 200 euro premium on it. So, and I'm broad brushing depending on the Chinese companies and default values, or for the sake of me, CBAM is changing how you do business. It's changing who you're buying from, and this announcement now tells the Chinese government, hey, China, we will recognize that in China it's CCERs, a portion of their total compliance that can be met with offsets. We will recognize that as CBAM applicable, which will then incentivize China to further potentially grow their cost of carbon, because the Chinese Bao Steel in China is going to be lobbying the Chinese government to say, hey, I'm losing business in Europe because my steel now has a 200 euro premium on it. I'm losing out to ThyssenKrupp in Europe. I'm not very happy with that. Please help me. And so it's creating this massive rise of global carbon. I could sit here for 10 minutes talking to all countries in the last 6 months have announced.
Never got so excited about
Oh, I love this stuff. It's creating, it's really changing the wider strategic picture here. So if you're a company in Germany, take a step back. You will have to pay a significant cost of carbon if you import goods into Europe. If you're not prepared, if you're using default values, and then you have to look at how these policies are changing the host countries. We do a lot of stuff with private equity. If I'm a private equity company in Germany, where am I building my cement mill? Where am I building my steel? If I'm doing M&As, what steel company am I buying? And now part of the equation is what jurisdiction is that steel company in, and what carbon costs do they have? Because that is going to potentially impact the competitiveness that steel company has to the company in Germany. So the spider web here, it gets tangled very quickly. And again, I appreciate I'm probably broad brushing some of this because it's very nuanced, and it's hard to talk about the nuance with 5 minutes. But broadly speaking, that is the big picture.
Oh, I'm not kidding. I get excited about CBAM and the impact, and I wasn't aware of it, and that's always great, right? Maybe just before we close off, what does that mean on a timeline? So these new things that just came out, when can we expect them to translate into actual regulation?
Depends. If it's an implementing act, I'd say somewhere between H2 2026. We have, so CBAM is going to be changing constantly. I'd say basically every month for the next 8 months, I'd expect an announcement. We'd have, we're going to see CBAM likely expand, new sectors, ceramics, refining. Just take organic chemicals, one of the sectors that is likely going to be included in CBAM. Adding one sector, organic chemicals, is going to completely double the CN code exposure of this regime. So we're going to expand horizontally with new sectors, expand vertically with downstream. We might get potential incorporation of new emissions. And so from a European Commission perspective and EU perspective, the policy is going to be changing. And then as I'm talking about, we're going to see countries responding to so if I'm a project developer in Brazil, the Brazilian government is now going to be looking at CBAM and saying, okay, let's get on our cost of carbon now, because we have clients in Brazil. What are they doing right now? They're lobbying the Brazilian government. And so you're going to see changes on both sides of the aisle. In the EU, via the actual CBAM legislation itself changing, and from responses from various trading partners.
Super exciting. Dan, thank you so much for coming on to